Today, and I'd like to say from the start that this spotlight makes me feel as though I'm in an interrogation room right now, so hopefully that feeling will pass very soon. I'd like to say that my contribution here this afternoon will probably be less formal than my two colleagues, whose very powerful presentations, actually so well prepared. I certainly don't represent myself as a scholar of the Middle East or of Palestine. I was asked basically to come here this afternoon to see whether or not our experiences in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, could in any way speak to the ongoing struggle of Palestinians for their land. And coming from Northern Ireland as I do, from the city of Derry, I think that what I'd like to do very briefly this afternoon, and I won't take too much of your time because I sense that you probably have quite a few questions already arising from the other presentations. I'd just like to go through a couple of observations that I have about growing up in Ireland before I came to Canada, and how that speaks, I suppose, to the struggle that we have had in Ireland against British colonialism, how that struggle speaks to the present peace process in Northern Ireland, and what reflections it may have for the future of Palestine and the future of Israel. And in some ways this might be a good time to make some of these comparisons, because as you know, Barack Obama has chosen Senator George Mitchell to be his special envoy for the Middle East, and it was Senator George Mitchell who was chosen by Bill Clinton to be the American Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. And so Mitchell had quite a bit of experience in bringing together the various parties to the conflicts in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And he undoubtedly will be drawing on some of this experience in his future negotiations in the Middle East. So one of the things I'd like to do, I think, in referring to some of my experiences from back home, and why I think it's connected to Palestine, is because, first and foremost, I think there are, as the first speaker said very cogently, so many myths and stereotypes floating around with respect to these troubling areas of conflict in the world today. The stereotypes, traditional stereotypes of Palestinians as being terrorists and troublemakers, similar stereotypes of Irish being fighters and brawlers and terrorists as well in their own right. So I think one of the ways that we break through these barriers, these stereotypes, to make contact with the real people on the other side, is to show how the experiences we had in Ireland are, in some respects, not all respects of course, quite similar to those of other occupied territories. And that would certainly include Palestine, but also would include some of the experiences of South Africans, of people in Cyprus, and if we go back even further, the struggles for independence in places like Malaya and Kenya. That occupation does impose a similar set of conditions, even though there are going to be differences depending upon which part of the world we're talking about. So it's to break through the stereotypes and mythologies is one of the things that I hope that my few words can contribute here this afternoon. So what I'd like to suggest to you is there are a number of similar characteristics to many colonial societies. Societies which have, in a sense, experienced the presence of an external power, either Great Britain or other European powers, which has come in to take land from a native population and to impose its own form of rule and administration. And I'd like to briefly go through what I regard as some of the characteristics of a colonial society and draw some parallels between Northern Ireland and Palestine. And these characteristics would include, one I would think is important, is what I would call demographic manipulation. Demographic manipulation. Another is what I would call external dependence. Another would be segregation and discrimination. Another would be the underdevelopment of basic social services. And the last one I'll address is the issue of conflict and violence. So going back to the start then, the issue of demographic manipulation in many colonial societies is very important. It's very important in Israel that for the Zionists, the Jews maintain a demographic majority in the state of Israel and in the occupied areas that they're expanding upon all the time. The demographic problem for the Israeli Jews is fundamental to their sense of insecurity and their aggression. And of course, they've many ways to manipulate the demographic domination that they require. And they've done so by, of course, putting Palestinians under a different martial set of law in the occupied areas. Through the law of return, that Jews from different parts of the world can come in and claim immediate citizenship rights, whereas most of the Israeli Arabs are second-class citizens. Well, in Ireland as well, there was an important aspect of demographic manipulation. And without going through the entire history of the struggle for Irish freedom against British colonialism, you probably know at least that, I suppose if we go back to the earliest invasions from England, in the 12th century, Ireland has experienced 900 years of British misrule over the centuries. And those 900 years created a number over the years of rebellions and insurgencies. And one of the things which is frequently not understood outside of Ireland is that many of these rebellions were made up of Protestants and Catholics fighting together against British rule. In 1798, the rise of the United Irishmen was a revolutionary movement led by Wolfe Tone, who was a Protestant. Around the same time, we have leaders from Northern Ireland. Henry Joy McCracken was another revolutionary Protestant. And so, over the years, the conditions that the British imposed on Ireland, which led to massive starvation and famine and poverty throughout the rural areas, led to these insurgencies and rebellions, many of which were supported by both Protestants and Catholics. And so we find in parts of Ireland, particularly the northern part of Ireland, after the United Irishmen, the growth of a movement which is rather like Zionism. And in Ireland we refer to it as Orangism. Orangism. It was the movement that Protestant landlords in the 18th century, to start with, developed as a way of bringing all Protestants under their control and under a central ideology. And the ideology, of course, was Protestants versus Catholics. And Orangism became very important later in Northern Ireland. It's the equivalent of Zionism, because it says to Protestants that the most important thing is your religious belief in Protestantism. And by saying that, of course, the differences between working class and capitalist, the difference between peasant and landlord, are smoothed over. That Orangism played the role of smoothing over and papering over the class contradictions that existed throughout Ireland, and producing a settler kind of minority of Protestants who, in a sense, only saw themselves as that particular kind of identity. So the conditions in Ireland ultimately led, of course, after the Irish famine and so forth, to the War of Independence from 1919 till 1921. And the British solution to that, because, of course, Britain didn't want to renounce any part of Ireland, it was against Home Rule for the most part, but because of the strength of the Republican forces, the IRA, it was forced into a historic compromise, as some would say, that it decided to partition Ireland. And it partitioned the north from the south. But this is why I call it demographic manipulation, because today what's referred to as Ulster, as Northern Ireland, is only 6 counties, whereas the original historical province of Ulster was 9 counties. So those 3 counties were given to the south of Ireland because the Protestant majority in the north wanted a state in which it exercised demographic dominance. This is very similar, I think, to the partition of Israel. and Palestine. The partition was used systematically by the British government in a sense to prop up and enforce the colonial elites which it supported, which it had put there in the first place, and to achieve, as we say in Ireland, ascendancy over the native population. So demographic manipulation, I think, is important when we look at colonial societies, particularly with respect to Palestine and Ireland. And in Ireland, after partition, the Protestant ascendancy used many different ways to ensure its continued demographic dominance. And one of the ways, in the city I come from, Derry City, which actually numerically was made up of 2/3 Catholic, 1/3 Protestant, because of the voting procedures used throughout Northern Ireland up until the 1960s, the Protestants succeeded in controlling the city council. Because for the most part in Northern Ireland, the only people who could vote in city councils were those who owned property, who paid rates. If you didn't own property, you were disenfranchised. However, if you owned more than £30 of rateable property per square hectare, then you could have more than one vote. So business exercised what they call plural votes. There was voting pluralism. So you can see which way this is going. Those with the wealth and the power succeeded in dominating politically as well as economically the province of Northern Ireland, which was set up as the Orange State. So that's the first point, demographic manipulation. Moving on then to the second point of external dependence, because states like Northern Ireland and Israel remain forever dependent upon, as the second speaker said very eloquently, some kind of imperial power, some kind of metropolitan power. And in the case of Northern Ireland, of course, this was England, because the people, the Unionists and Loyalists who controlled the Orange State in Northern Ireland saw themselves as part of the United Kingdom. So the importance of external dependence, I think, can't be overstated, particularly by those of us in movements to change and resist colonialism. Because once these external sources of dependence withdraw their support, what happens? What happened to South Africa once the US Congress decided to impose sanctions? What is going to happen to Northern Ireland once the British decide they've had enough with it? What's going to happen to Israel once the Americans stop the arms trade, the billion dollar arms trade which keeps the Israeli state alive? So the second point then, the importance of external dependence. My third point is well known, and I won't say too much more about it, the importance of segregation and discrimination. Because in all colonial settler states, there is, to use the anthropological term, great social distance between the colonizers and the colonized. Great social distance. It could be the distance between black and white in South Africa. It could be the difference between Arab and Jew in Palestine, in Israel. And in Northern Ireland, it was the difference between the loyalists and the nationalist population. And I will refer to in those terms, not Catholics and Protestants, because not all Protestants were loyalists. As I said at the beginning, Wolfe Tone was a Protestant, but he certainly wasn't a loyalist. He was a revolutionary Republican. So we'll talk about the nationalist population and the loyalist population. So segregation and discrimination in Northern Ireland, maybe to your surprise, was prevalent throughout the time that I grew up there and continues, notwithstanding the peace process. How does it work? Well, we would say that Northern Ireland was an apartheid state. It's not generally referred to that, but if you examine the details, it certainly was. We went to different schools. Protestants went to their school, Catholics went to theirs. We played different sports, if you can believe that. The Protestant kids played cricket and rugby. The Catholics, we played Gaelic football and hurling. The only place we may occasionally join forces is soccer, because soccer was really supported by both communities, and boxing and combat sports. In many other respects, there was segregation and discrimination, sectarianism as we refer to it in Ireland. One of those areas, of course, was in houses, the allocation of houses, the allocation of jobs. Houses were allocated by the city councils, but if the city councils were undemocratically controlled by the Orangemen and by the Unionists, then of course Catholics never had equal opportunity to apply for city housing. In the big industrial centres in Belfast, the shipyarding, Harlan, Wolfworks, the unions were run by the Protestants, and to get jobs was very difficult if you were outside that kind of a club. So discrimination was important in housing, in education, in personal lifestyles and employment. But one area where it was felt the most is in law enforcement. Because in Northern Ireland, again when I grew up, there were very definite biases towards the nationalist population. The first one, I suppose, was the Special Powers Act, which today has been replaced by the terrorist legislation. But the Special Powers Act was an act which was applied mostly against Catholic and nationalist areas. There were a whole set of different provisions that you could be arrested and imprisoned for. And one part of it was called the Flags and Emblems Act. If you flew the Irish tricolour, if you sang rebel songs, and in certain areas if you spoke the Irish language, you could be subject at least to arrest and to fine. There was one particular provision of the Special Powers Act which said anyone who is caught contributing to a breach of peace for a cause which is not specifically provided for in any of the foregoing provisions can be summarily arrested. In other words, carte blanche. You could be arrested for whatever the police force decided was bothering them at a given time. So the Catholic majority really opposed the Special Powers Act. It was used against them extensively. It was used to repress any forms of political protest and dissent. Another aspect of discrimination in Northern Ireland was, of course, the police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, but even worse, a volunteer police force we refer to as the B Specials, the Special Constabulary. And these were part-time police officers who were given guns and truncheons they could take home, but they weren't part of the regular police force. And they were also involved with gangs who often harassed Catholic areas. And the B Specials, particularly in the 1960s with the rise of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, routinely went into Catholic areas, brutalised those areas, sometimes burnt out houses and communities and forced large numbers of people to flee over the border into the Irish Republic to escape their wrath. So that was also a major source of discrimination which was actively protested by the nationalist population in the north. And this in many ways I think parallels the regulations which have been used against Palestinians by the Zionist state in the same way that these were used by the Orange state. And more recently, with the growth of the armed struggle and the rise of the provisional IRA after 1970, there are other things which were applied, which are even worse. And one of them, of course, with the occupation of the military force, was the growth of torture and depth interrogation in Northern Ireland, way beyond before we'd heard of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. In the 1960s, Republican prisoners were being taken into police barracks and army barracks. They were being hooded. They were being put to stand in front of a wall for 42, 72 hours with white noise machines whirling in the back. If they fell down, they were kicked in vital parts of the body until they stood up and resumed their position, what Rumsfeld now called stress positions. These were being used in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And they were being used because they were part of an experiment on sensory deprivation that was being done by the British Army. There's a very good book about this, incidentally, called The Guinea Pigs by a guy called John McGuffin, which explains this in great detail. So we were subject in Northern Ireland to techniques which would later become quite popular in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, but one of the early experimental grounds was Castlereagh Barracks and the Girdwood Barracks and so on and so forth outside Belfast. and Derry. So discrimination and sectarianism, an important aspect of the colonial state as well, whether it's Ireland, Palestine, South Africa, or wherever. Moving on to the importance of the underdevelopment of social services, that we find that Northern Ireland, generally speaking, was one of the least developed parts of the United Kingdom. Its unemployment rates were very high. Its levels of housing development and dilapidation were very high. You go into the ghetto areas, either in Belfast or Derry, and I should say either into the Protestant or Catholic areas. There was, in many cases, equal sense of deprivation and poverty. That if you go into the Sandy Row in East Belfast, which is a very loyalist Protestant area, you can find the same degree of housing decomposition as you will in the Falls Road in Belfast or the Lecky Road in Derry. So the burden was being borne, as it always is, by the working class, by those least able to change their conditions, who have the least power. The only thing was that the Protestant working class was still persuaded that their real allegiance was to the Orange State and to their Orange masters, whether they were industrial businessmen or landlords or whatever. So that's really what kept Catholics and Protestants from forming united forms of opposition. And my final point, I've just mentioned briefly, is the issue of conflict and violence. Because the sad truth is that colonial societies are violent societies. They are formed through violence. That Israel and the Jewish settlers took land violently from the Palestinians through the Nakba. Almost 1 million people were ethnically cleansed. And in Irish history, we have the same history of settlement and conquest and plantation through the early Tudor Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, onto the Stuart monarchies, and worse of all under Cromwell. And under Cromwell, of course, we had many instances of what happened in Gaza. In two places, particularly in 1649, Cromwell's armies invaded the cities of Wexford and Drogheda and massacred every single living thing, not just man, woman and child, but horses and pigs and goats and ducks and everything. And if you go to the town of Drogheda today, you'll find the main street is still called Scarlet Street. Scarlet after the blood that ran down, occasioned by the ruthless siege and invasion of that city. And Cromwell in Ireland is actually regarded as the Adolf Hitler of English history. He's not thought of that way necessarily in England, but in Ireland, if you mention the word Cromwell, particularly in a nationalist or Republican area, he is, for all intents and purposes, the Adolf Hitler. His hatred of the Irish natives was so great. So that then really kind of is what I wanted to say about the characteristics of colonial society. As far as the resistance towards this, the protest movements that developed in Northern Ireland over the past 40 years, I would say, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be dogmatic. But when we look back at the resistance to Orangism, we can see at least 3 different phases, I think. The first phase, beginning in the early 1960s, was a kind of a phase, a civil rights phase, which was largely supported by middle class. It was lawyers and teachers and university people and students who formed the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And they were very much inspired by Martin Luther King. And after Martin Luther King's march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association decided it would do something similar, and it organised a march from Belfast to Derry, which is about 85 miles. And after the march got within 10 miles of Derry, it was ambushed by loyalist thugs, and many people were hurt. I don't think anybody was killed at that time, but it was the beginning of a violent Protestant backlash, a loyalist backlash against the civil rights movement, which was demanding, as we said back then, one man, one vote. We'd say today, one person, one vote. an end to the property disqualification of Catholics, an end to voting pluralism. One person, one vote was a very simple demand. It wanted an end to the Special Powers Act, which was used so brutally against the nationalist population. It also wanted to change the Royal Ulster Constabulary, because that was an all-Protestant police force, and it was used as an army of occupation in the nationalist areas. So after the 1960s passed, we see a deepening of the civil rights movement. It passes from just being a middle-class movement. It becomes more working class. So the urban youth get more increasingly involved, particularly in the ghetto areas. And part of the reason for this is because defence committees were having to be formed in Catholic areas of the big city, Belfast and Derry, because of the loyalist backlash. People were being burnt out of their houses. Cars were going through at night and shooting people dead at random. So there was a great need, in a sense, to develop greater defence committees, and more people came out onto the street. That the protest passed from being a middle-class civil rights protest into being street protest, or what the state referred to as riots, but they weren't really riots at all. They were attempts to defend their areas and also to parade and demonstrate their opposition to the intolerance of the Orange State. 1969, the Battle of the Bogside, I was talking to someone about that, is when a whole community in Derry rose up against the RUC, and there was a pitched battle where the RUC used CN gas and batons and water cannons and the whole bit, and the kids finally graduated from using catapults to using petrol bombs, as we call them, Molotov cocktails back. So 1969 is when we see the British Army introduced into the north. And again, surprising to you as this may be, when the British Army first came into the Catholic areas, they were welcomed by many of the neighbourhoods there. I can remember women down the Lecky Road in Derry coming out with cups of tea and jam butties, as we call them, jam sandwiches to give to the soldiers. Why were they welcomed? Because they were perceived to be a peacekeeping force which was going to keep the loyalist murder gangs out of the Catholic areas. It didn't turn out that way. The penny dropped later when it was clear that the real reason that the British had come in wasn't as a peacekeeping force. They'd come in to prop up a state and a government which no longer had any legitimacy amongst 1/3 of the population. That's why they'd come in. We thought originally they'd come in as peacekeepers. They'd come in their own way to make sure that the security and stability of the Orange State was to be maintained. So at that point, the street protest graduate evolved to their last point. They become a mass movement, And with the mass movement, the British Army then introduced something which was very unpopular: internment without trial. Again, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib. That Republican suspects, for the most part, and a few loyalists, were picked up, put behind bars in Long Kesh Camp and McGilligan Camp indefinitely, without necessarily being charged, but simply on suspicion of being Republican. So the introduction of internment accelerated the mass movements of protest in Ireland. And we had, in a sense, an intifada. We didn't know the name back then, but in fact that's what it was. A street intifada, fighting back at the army, fighting back at the RUC, the police force which had occupied and oppressed the people for so long. And in 1972, one of the biggest mass protests in Derry's history came out as an anti-internment protest. And something happened on January the 30th which changed everything. And that, of course, was that the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment opened up and shot 27 people, 14 whom were shot dead, and the others severely wounded. So the Parachute Regiment opened up and killed unarmed demonstrators. And that's what's referred to as Bloody Sunday. Some of you may have heard it through U2's song about that. That, more than anything else, accelerated the change from simply civil protest to armed struggle. because at that point the provisional IRA broke away from the official IRA, largely on the issue that the official IRA had no guns, no weapons with which to protect the Catholic areas. The issue at that time was defence of Catholic and nationalist areas. So from 1970 we see an acceleration of the armed struggle with the provisional IRA, but not just with them, with the growth of other armed Republican groups, the INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, and later of course the real IRA, the Continuity IRA, on one side, and the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, the Loyalist paramilitary groups on the other. So all this moves, and the state of the conflict and the violence increases and escalates, and there were a number of very kind of unfortunate events which happened during that time, which even in nationalist areas led people, in a sense, to look for a cessation of the hostilities down the road. The Enniskillen bombing was one, the Omagh bombing, of course, came later. So this brings us basically, I suppose, to 1994, where George Mitchell gets involved and brings together some of the conflicting parties, including the provisionals. The provisionals declare a temporary ceasefire, and of course later in 2005 the provisionals said, they announced they had permanently shut down their armed campaign for good and had decommissioned all their weapons. So in a sense, that's where we are in Northern Ireland at the moment, that since 2004 with the Good Friday Agreement, we've seen an attempt to put together a government in Northern Ireland which is based on the principle of power sharing between the loyalist and the nationalist communities. And how does Northern Ireland look from today's perspective, as someone who still goes over there a fair bit? Well, I'd have to say that although the peace initiative, in a sense, has brought to an end the immediate hostilities between the paramilitaries, there is still a lot of violence in Northern Ireland. And much of it is civil violence. Much of it is becoming in the certain areas directed towards immigrants, towards gay and lesbian people. There's a certain amount of homophobic violence, that a lot of the kids who would have gone into the paramilitaries are still existing in the state of poverty and unemployment, that all the peace process in the world have not really solved those problems. And so, in conclusion, I think I've spent long enough, I think it's important to remember that what really drove the peace process wasn't George Mitchell, and it wasn't Tony Blair and the British government. What really drove the peace process were the communities themselves, the communities which had given birth to the civil rights movement in the first place, which had tried everything to get their demands to democratise the state and had been only confronted through violence by the state. It was the people themselves who, after the armed campaign, in a sense, drove the peace movement. And the reason the IRA finished its armed campaign wasn't because of the British Army. The British Army acknowledges that the IRA could not be beaten. The reason the IRA ceased its campaign is because of pressure, popular pressure from the community which it was intending to represent, and which it did represent for the early part of the struggle. So in conclusion, I would say for us now, looking at that situation and looking at Palestine, it's true that the peace process has stopped for the time being, the clash between paramilitaries. But the colonial state still exists. It is still a kind of a state, an artificial state within the larger Irish nation. And so although the peace process may constitute a step, and unfortunately it's not a step which is irreversible, we could see reversals, but it's not the real final step. The real final step for Ireland and for Palestine is a thoroughgoing process of decolonisation. Thank you.